to invite Dr. Jeff Krichmar from who is currently a professor in the Department of Cognitive Sciences and the Department of Computer Science at University of California, Irvine. And he has published quite extensively in this research area. He has about 150 publications and about 7 patents, and funded by several agencies, including DARPA, IARPA, ONR, and National Science Foundation. And he also works extensively with industry, including Qualcomm, Northrop Grumman, and Toyota Motor. His current research interests include neurorobotics, embodied cognition, biologically plausible models of learning and memory, and neuromorphic applications and tools. And he's also looking at the effect of neural architecture on neural function. And I had the pleasure of working with Jeff on lifelong learning models, and he's a great collaborator, and it's an honor to have him here today. Jeff, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Durisha. And thank you for inviting me. And sorry I can't be there in person, but hopefully sometime soon I'll visit you. Yeah, and the name of the lab that I run is the Cognitive Anteater Robotics Laboratory. So Carl, so all our robots are named Carl something. Anteater is, for some reason, the UC Irvine mascot. And I think your mascot is Rowdy the Roadrunner.
Right.
Yeah, so we're Peter the Anteater. And just you mentioned Toyota, and this is sort of a cartoon of our Toyota robot, the human support robot. But I'll be talking about some different robots in our lab today. And this recent work on our path planning and navigation, and it's based on 3 papers, and I'll try to get through them all in the time allotted. One was to introduce a neuromorphic compatible path planning algorithm using spiking neurons. And then we followed that up with using that to analyze some human navigation data. And that's the second paper. And then the third paper that we just recently put on bioRxiv shows how you can extend this to make it flexible and learn the maps as it's planning paths. So I'm going to go through these one by one. If anything's confusing, just halt me and I'll try and explain it, or I can answer your questions towards the end. So navigation takes 2 things. One, you need a map. And then once you have the map, you need to use it somehow and plan some sort of future movements, hopefully optimal, not like this robot in the lower right corner. And this is an area of interest in robotics for decades now. And it's also important for neurobiology and biological organisms. And they're both bound by the common constraints of the limitations of your sensing and actuating, and also energy needs, because you have to plan efficient paths too if you're on battery power, or if you're an animal on limited food resources. So it's an interesting problem for both those areas, and I'm going to try and touch on it in both ways. So this was work by my former student Tiffany Hu and other students, Alex Wang, and then a postdoc, Nick Oros. And we developed this algorithm and then tested it in this area. So this park is the center of our campus, and hopefully sometime you can visit me. It's a beautiful park, but it's also very rich for testing robot algorithms. So as you can see, there's grass, there's pavement, there's dirt, there's all manner of obstacles, not to mention students coming and going. So it makes for a nice test bed. And so we developed a path planning algorithm that's based on wavefront propagation. And so wavefront propagation is one of those families of path planning algorithms used for robotics, but we wanted to introduce a spiking version of that. And it was developed at the Telluride Neuromorphic Cognition Workshop. And one of the nice things about this compared to other algorithms, it's able to run on highly parallel, event-driven, low power neuromorphic hardware. And so that actually has some benefits for embedded applications. And there are two pieces from neurobiology that inspired it. One is axonal plasticity, and another is this notion of hippocampal replay and preplay. So I'll just briefly talk about the neurobiological inspiration for this model. So one is, in recent years, it's found that the axons that basically send a message from one neuron to another, the axons themselves are plastic. And for those of you who are not familiar with neuroscience, or maybe haven't heard of this, there's a myelin sheath that acts like an insulator on the axon, which is like a wire, and the signal is sent from one neuron to another. And so with experience, the insulation of this myelin sheath can get thicker, and then there's these repeating nodes that repeats the signal, and the number of these can change. So with experience, you get potentially faster velocity conductance, faster conductance velocities, and also a better synchrony, and maybe faster reaction time. So I thought that was interesting, and a plasticity rule that really hasn't been used in neural nets. And the other piece of evidence that we wanted to build on was hippocampal replay and preplay. So, they've recorded from rats in the hippocampus, and they have what's known as place cells. And if a rat runs, for example, along this linear track, you see a series of neurons being active along the way. All right. And then sometimes when the rat gets to the endpoint, you see the sequence played backwards. But the one I'm more interested in is, what is the rat doing when it's thinking about going on this path? And you see this preplay that actually plays out, kind of predicting what the rat will do, so it's thinking about the places it's going to go. So with that, the preplay idea and the ability of axons to change over time, we developed a model that basically took the biological neuron and the axon and really simplified this down to just have it be a binary spike with a long refractory period, and then have the learning not at the synapse, but actually the delay between neurons. And I can go over the equations later. I'm not going to go over it now, but I just want to show you that this is all the equations for the model. So it's just a very lightweight model, which is nice and makes it quite efficient. Okay, so let me demonstrate the model. Let's say I want to go from this start in the upper left part of this environment to a goal down lower right. And each of these circles is a neuron. And so it's a neural net, and the neurons are connected to their neighbors. And in the middle, this gray area, it's twice as hard to get through this gray area. All right. And so if I start this by firing this neuron, it causes its neighbors to fire. It causes its neighbors to fire, but since this is twice as hard to fire, it takes longer for this message to get across. So that's how the delay is actually working in this algorithm. And if I just play it forward, this neuron is now, the goal neuron now fires. And then all I have to do is look at which neurons led to that firing, and I can back out an optimal path. And so we can use what they use in neuromorphic computing, an address event representation. So we can just pull out the address and the time of the firing, and then we actually have planned an optimal path, and then the robot or device can go on that path. And that's the general idea. In this first piece, these axons will be fixed, but in the last part of my talk, I'll show you how we can make these axons plastic and learn very quickly what the cost is of traversing through an unknown space. Okay, so just to give you an idea, we did this in our park. There's Tiffany about to start the robot, and the sidewalk and grass have the same cost, all right? And so then the robot just makes its shortest path across this grass, which is kind of bumpy and hilly. Obviously, sped up a bit. And this robot we developed in-house, so it's using a smartphone to drive the neural net algorithm is running on the smartphone, and the smartphone's GPS and compass are used to navigate. Okay, so what if we go to the same area, but this time the sidewalk has a lower cost than the grass, a lower cost to traverse. And so now the robot plans a path mostly on the sidewalk. Like I said, it's only using GPS and compass right now. So Tiffany is chasing after it, make sure it doesn't crash into anything. We've since built a road following algorithm for this setup. It does need a little manual intervention, at least when we did this a few years ago. Okay, and so what do I mean by lower cost? Well, if I have this map, this satellite image, I can set, if I have the map given, I can set the cost of traversing these yellow areas to be much higher than the cost in the middle, which would be the grassy area. And you see from different locations, the robot planned paths that look like a straight line that were optimal between 2 points. But now if I change the map and make the sidewalk less costly to traverse and the middle part sort of moderately costly, then it plans paths on the sidewalk when it can. And when I say costly, that means that the time for sending a message across from one neuron to another is moderately high here. I think it was just one time step on the dark blue and a very high number for the borders. And then we can also introduce in the map things like there's bushes and benches and things and light poles, so we can put that into the map. And then you see a mixture of both going on the path and making a shortcut across the grass. So it shows that just by changing the delays in these axons, you can actually get very flexible path planning behavior. So just to wrap up this portion in this paper, this was a nice bio-inspired algorithm. It uses spiking neurons. It introduces a learning rule, which I haven't seen used very often in neural nets, where instead of the plasticity at the synapse, the plasticity is actually in the axon itself and the delay of sending in a message from one neuron to another. And we compared this to A-star, Dijkstra, and other algorithms, and the paths are just as efficient, or just as efficient as far as distance and the type of paths they plan as these other algorithms. But what's nice is this can be implemented on neuromorphic hardware, and then it can run in far lower power and much faster. And for example, a group from Johns Hopkins took our algorithm and demonstrated it on the True North system from IBM. Okay, so building on this and going more towards cognitive science, we wanted to see, in general, how do humans plan paths? And there's a lot of variation in how humans navigate around the world. And, we always say, like, some people have a terrible sense of direction, but, you could ask the question, well, why is that? What is it? Is there a reason there's such variation? Maybe there's a benefit to having such variation. So we wanted to kind of look at how people navigate. And we've been working with some neuroscientists and some psychologists on this issue, just the individual variation of navigation. And this is one of the setups. What they'll do is they'll put a person in a virtual reality, and in this task, they'll start them on a loop, and it's a training loop, and they'll have the person go several times through this loop. And then these diamonds here are landmarks of interest. And so here's kind of what they would see. And a landmark might be that, that little stairway ladder there. And then to test them, after they do several training loops, then they'll just put them in one of these places and say, go to another landmark, that like go from here to the ladder. Oh, someone asked about the simulation environment for the robot. Actually, the simulation environment was just MATLAB. And then we, once we were happy with it, then we took it out into the field. This one, you're right, the simulation environment, if you're asking about this one, this is Unity, from what I understand, in the VR lab. Because one of my students just started and she's learning Unity. Okay, so this was an interesting study, and we wanted to mimic it with our path planning algorithm. So they had 400 subjects. And there were 16 different start and goal locations. And I should have said they looped around 5 or 6 times before they were actually tested. And 170 of those, 79 of those subjects were just told to take the shortest path. And 222 were just told, go to the goal, all right? And this is our mock-up of it. So this was the learned route. And these are the landmarks that, this is roughly the same as the virtual reality environment. Now, people will use different ways to get around. They can apply what they call survey knowledge, which means you can take the shortest path, and sometimes that'll be a novel shortcut that you've never taken before. Some people use topological information. So they'll use landmarks. In our case, we use landmarks, or they might use, there's the third turn and then take a left and that kind of thing. And you can build kind of a topology of how they're actually navigating space. Some will take the route. So that would be a familiar route. So that would be the loop that they did 5 or 6 times. Sometimes they'll take the route, but go in reverse. So we built we modeled each of these type of strategies. And for the survey one, we used the wavefront propagation algorithm I showed before. And for the topological, we used the same wavefront algorithm, but we used it to plan a path between the nearest landmark. And then when you got to that nearest landmark, you go to the next nearest landmark. And that was the topological version. And then we hypothesized that people might not just use one strategy even within a test trial. They might actually do one the first half and then switch to another the second half. So we also included a bunch of strategies that we call mixed path strategies, where you might go on the route and then do the survey and take a shortcut. Okay, so this will take a little bit of explaining. This is what the subject did. So they were supposed to go from this green dot to this cyan dot. And this lighter blue path is the way they traversed. And so then we ran all the different strategies with that start and end point. And this is the survey strategy, the topological strategy. This would be if you took the route, and this would be if you took the route in reverse. And then we use something called the Frechet distance, which is good for this kind of data to actually get a distance metric. And so the smaller the number, the closer the match. And you can see by this A and C here that the survey strategy is the closest match to the subject's trajectory. And in general, this subject seemed to always take novel shortcuts when they were available. So this is just the one trial here, but this is the 24 trials. And so the best match for this subject seemed to be always using this survey strategy and taking the shortest path and novel shortcuts they hadn't done before. And now compare that with this subject. So this subject, here's what they did. And here are all the different strategies. And you can see the route strategy, the subject is very close to going on that learned route. And so you see that distance metric is much lower for the route. And then if you look at all 24 trials, this was a subject that always did that strategy. And so if you look at the population as a whole, most of them did a survey. A lot of them did the route, and then a lot less did the topological, which we were kind of surprised. But there was a number of them that started on a route, either forward or reverse. And then at some point, maybe they said, hey, I know where I'm going, and then took a shortcut. And so this part was shown by their original data, but this mixing of strategy was not shown. And also some of the subjects did not always do the same thing. So from one trial to the next, they varied. So there's a lot more variation than originally reported. And another interesting thing is, if you told the subjects to take the shortest path possible, you see a lot of these routes disappear, and you see an increase in the usage of this survey knowledge. And so what's that saying is that some people might have just taken that familiar route just because it's familiar, but they had the ability to take a shortcut if they were pressed to do it. And I'll explain our theory why that's possible, why that's happening. Oh, is the purple lines a route? So let's go back. This line here is what the person did. This is their trajectory, and these are what the models would predict. Okay. The route, just because this is important to get now, the route was this loop that they did, and they did this loop 5 or 6 times. And you could see when they do this loop, they are seeing all of the landmarks. But then when you did the test, you'd place them at a landmark here and say, go to this landmark here. And they're in the VR, so they'd have to figure out a path to do that. And same with our wavefront propagation. We'd put fire a neuron here, and the wave would propagate out to here, and then we back out the path. Hopefully that answers that. Okay. So yeah, so it's interesting that shortcuts, oops, one more question. Okay, good. Yeah, because this is important because that leads to the next thing I want to show. So this was interesting because a lot of people do have the ability to take that shortcut or have what they call survey knowledge, but they for whatever reason choose not to use it. And so the question was, what determines the mix, and also why might they do this? Why might they change from using a familiar route to actually using novel shortcuts? So we built a bunch of simulated mazes in the same vein, but a little more complicated than what they use with the humans. Each one had a route that would be the familiar route, and then we varied. So the green would be where the route is, and that has a cost of traversal of 1, but the blue can vary. So for example, if we wanted to go to the goal and use the route, maybe use the route more often, the blue might be 16 times more costly, or take 16 times more for a neuron to send a message to another neuron than the green part of the route. Or it could be 2 times more costly. And in this case, when it was 16 times more costly, this path took the learned route. But when it's 2 times more costly, our path planner picked a novel shortcut. And so we wonder, well, is this cost of traversal maybe what's causing this ability this distribution of strategies and also the ability to show shortcuts. So if you had it 16 times more costly, you see a distribution of strategies that is very, very similar to what the humans did before. And then if you make it 2 times more costly to take a novel path, you see that the route strategy drops and the survey strategy goes up, just like with the human data. So this kind of suggests that there's some sort of assumed mental effort or cognitive load that might be the reason why subjects are using the survey knowledge. So they might just use that familiar route because it's easy and not much effort, but if they really wanted to make the effort, a lot of them have the ability to take a shortcut. And let's see, this might actually be quite interesting for robotics too. There's just such variation, and you think that, the variation might not be like, I'm a good navigator, I'm a terrible navigator. It might be that this variation has some benefits, especially if you're talking about at the population level. You might be more efficient and gather more information if you mix a whole bunch of different strategies. And so that's one thing that we're going with in a test with robotic swarms. And we showed a lot more variability than what they, when we analyze this again, compared to what they originally reported. Oh, and I should have said that at the very beginning. This work was done with myself and Carol He, who's a grad student at UC Santa Barbara that collected a lot of this data, but she really did a really wonderful job analyzing this data and coming with some of these conclusions. And I think one of the important things is that this mental cost or mental effort might actually be what's happening between these different strategies. Okay, I'm doing pretty good on time, so let's go to the last study. And this was work that actually with my colleagues from the Lifelong Learning Machines, the DARPA project, Praveen Pillai and Nick Ketz and Andrea Sotaggio. And we were very interested in the notion of pre-play. But the more I thought about it, there's also something called vicarious trial and error that might fit this idea better. And I'll explain that in just a few moments. But the issue with the prior stuff I showed you is the map was given, it's known. And in many of these path blending algorithms, that is the case. So how do you deal with an unknown environment and still keeping with this lightweight algorithm that could potentially run on neuromorphic hardware? So we came across this paper, somewhat recent paper from Wolfgang Moss's group by Bellick et al. And they came up with a recurrent spiking neural net, a way to do back propagation through time. And the basic, once you get through a lot of the math, there's a very basic idea that's quite nice, where you have a loss function. And then for all the neurons in your recurrent spiking neural net, when they spike, they have an eligibility trace. So when you apply the loss, you apply it based on the neurons that in their eligibility trace. And so, we have basically our network's a recurrent spiking neural net. So we thought, well, we could probably apply this to our spike wavefront propagation algorithm. And just look at this short segment that goes from 12.4 to 12.6 on this map. And this is the spike wavefront propagation, because right now it doesn't know anything about this map. The yellow borders have a very high cost, I think like something like 200. The orange has a cost of about 100. And the blue has a moderate cost of initially, actually the blue has a cost of 1, and the neural network has initial waits or delays somewhere in between. And so when I put it to tell the neural network to go from 12.4 to 12.6 the first time, you see this wave of activity. And here's the end goal, and then it'll plan a path between these 2 points. But the loss now is, what is the value of the map and what is the value of the weight from location XY to IJ. So XY are the map coordinates and IJ is the postsynaptic neuron that's connected to that. And then I can just apply, when I get to my goal, this loss function to all the neurons that are eligible. So bright yellow was highly active, and then it decays. So it went from here to here to here. And so this is the last one that was active. So it's highly active, and you see this decay over time. And that decay is this eligibility trace that's applied to all the neurons. And so then when I apply this learning rule, I not only learn this path, but I might bleed over into some of these areas. So we assume that the agent can only see, only know about the actual map on places that are right next to it. So places that it would be able to use its local sensing. But that would include other corridors, right? Okay, so given that, we looked at this problem again that was done in the humans. And this time, we just gave it short segments around this loop so that the robot, the simulated robot, would actually traverse this loop. In this case, I'm going to show you traverse this loop 5 times. All right, and the same landmarks as before. And then we test it after it's done the loop 5 times on just randomly picking 2 landmarks for it to go from and to. And just to show you a video, on the left, it goes by quickly. So on the left will be the path it planned, and it'll say up here in the title whether it took a route or a shortcut. And on the right, we put a few blocks, blockades in there, just to see if we can push it to adapt to learn different routes. And so it's been trained on 6 loops around that familiar route. And then we run it. And hopefully you can see, I know it's going fast, but it's sometimes taking the route and then sometimes taking a novel shortcut. And learning is never turned off. So as it's taking these shortcuts, it's even learning more about the environment, taking more shortcuts. And you can see on the right that it's learned not to go through those blockades. And so it's flexibly adapted and planned new routes. And it happens very quickly. I was very impressed by this EPROP algorithm from Moss's group, because it really is nice and flexible. Okay. Oops, still going. I'll let it run to the end. But just by using this algorithm now, we're also seeing this variability that you would see in that you saw before when we were testing against the human data. But now it's actually a learning algorithm. So presumably you could put this in a novel environment and it would eventually learn what it needs of what's traversable in the environment and what's not traversable. And then also nicely, flexibility. So if the environment changes, it can adapt to that. All right, so what's the neural basis for this? So I talked about pre-play before, but you know, when you look at rats and you put them in a maze, there's this deliberation stage. And this is an old idea that goes back to Tolman called vicarious trial and error. And what Tolman and his colleagues saw, like in the 1930s or so, was when a rat got to a choice point, its head would turn left, its head would turn right, as if it was just thinking, what should I go? Should I go left? Should I go right? And they call that vicarious trial and error. And then when later on, when we had the recording techniques, people like David Reddish started recording from the rats as they were at that choice point and saw not only the head movement, but also saw like a neural trace of that deliberation. And so these are place cells that as the rat gets this choice point, you see this, and this is in the hippocampus. Do I go left? And then you see a bunch of place cells going forward. Do I go right? And then the rat makes a choice and goes right. And then later on, after it gets a little bit better at this, you don't see that deliberation. You just see the pre-play that I talked about earlier. So the rat gets this choice point, and then you see the sequence of place cells going to the right. So looking at the underlying activity of our network, we also see this. So let me first show you the setup. This is another Tolman maze, and there was it was recently used, well, recently, 10 years ago, while recording from hippocampus. And you basically train the rats to go from A to B over and over again, and then you put a couple blocks in there to force it to take a shortcut either this way or this way. All right. So here's our maze, and here's the first training child, and it's going from RA to RB. And this is the activity in the wave propagation. And so I would say that this is somewhat comparable to vicarious trial and error, where it's trying out different options on this maze and learning it. But by the 25th trial, it's going directly from A to B. But you see the eligibility trace, the number of neurons that were active and when they were active, looks much more like a pre-play. So there's this activity here, but it was played out kind of forward like that. And then it made the path from A to B. All right, so that's kind of interesting that we're seeing both this neural correlate of vicarious trial and error and also pre-play in this algorithm. And actually, it's quite useful. So when we put in the blockade, this algorithm, like the rat, will make mistakes. It'll try, even though there's a block here, to try and get through here. And then eventually, after each session is, I think, five trials. By trial 15, the errors almost go down to zero. And by trial 20, it's learned the novel shortcut. And so let me show you some data. So if we put the blockade here, this path won't work. So it has to learn to go this longer path. And you see the 5th trial, there's an error now because this was, this is after it's learned to go from A to B, we add the blockade. And so now there's uncertainty because it's in a situation that it wasn't trained on. And so then you get this vicarious trial and error, this activity that looks like this deliberation in the neural network. But then by the 20th trial, it has learned to take that different pathway, that novel pathway, and the eligibility trace is very tight, so it looks more like a pre-play. And then if we put the blockade at location 2, it's actually shorter to go on this left kind of route. And so you see on the 5th trial, it's trying but making errors. There's a lot of activity, so it's deliberating. By the 20th trial, it's got a pre-play that really nicely matches where it intends to go. And it's learned the shorter path to get now around this blockade. Okay. So this shows that this path planning algorithm with these biologically plausible learning rules can learn sequences and demonstrate the flexible path planning in different environments. So we compared it to humans. I showed you the comparison to the rat data with this Tolman detour. And then in the paper, if you're interested, there's also a comparison with the Morris water maze in an open field and make some predictions about that. So what's nice about this is it's able to learn unknown environments and seems to be very rapid and able to readapt when there's change in those environments. And there were certain neural correlates for assessing the alternatives. So one, vicarious trial and error when the environment's unfamiliar or changes, so it's uncertain. And then two, a pre-play activity when it's planning kind of what it believes is a familiar path. And so where are we going with this next? Hopefully you can see it. On the left, there's a video. This is the Wii Bot Simulator. And if you can see the three little moving dots, those are actually very detailed simulations of the Willow, actually now it's ClearPath, PR2 robot. And they are all using the path planning algorithms I discussed earlier. The idea is to see and test the idea that having a variety of different path planning algorithms or strategies could more efficiently traverse this area and gather information. And then we can also, with this simulation, change the number of robots to see at what point does this break down. And we chose the PR2 because it's quite similar to our Toyota robot in the Wii Bot Simulator. So eventually we only have one Toyota robot. So we wanted to also do the heterogeneous swarm in simulation. Now on the right, we're quite excited. We just got this robot from ClearPath Robotics called the Jackal, and they're a Canadian outfit. There's no snow in Irvine, but we're going to test it on our park and then in other areas. So obviously this robot is quite rugged and can go over rough terrain. So now we're going to test some of the algorithms with real sensing and see if it can learn what areas this robot can traverse and what areas this robot should avoid. Okay, so just wrapping up, and then I'll take questions. So we presented this neuromorphic path planning algorithm. It's compatible with low power hardware, and we do have plans to try it out on different neuromorphic chips. And it's quite low computation due to the simple neural elements, and you can imagine that this can be run completely in parallel. And it does take advantage, and some of the new neuromorphic chips do have flexible delays between neurons. And so that's something that we want to try in some of these chips. We showed in simulations of human and rodent navigation that the algorithm can flexibly plan efficient paths, rapidly recover from perturbations, and suggest that the variation in navigation is not that I'm a terrible navigator, I'm a good navigator, actually could be a benefit if you look at it at a population level. And also I want to mention that the first conclusion that maybe the difference in what people do from a point-to-point, trial-to-trial basis might be the amount of cognitive effort they're willing to put to the navigation problem at that time. And so we're excited that this flexibility could be realized in a bunch of autonomous systems, self-driving cars, and then also robotic swarms. All right, so thank you. I will take questions. There's more information on our website, and then we have a YouTube channel where we put our stupid robot tricks. And then I should mention the nice funding support that we've gotten over the years to work on this project. All right, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Jeff. There was one question about the Jackal robot.
Oh, sure. In chat?
Yes.
Oh, I just got it last week, but it uses ROS. I can't tell you about the sensors and motors. We had a custom made with a really good GPS unit and a different camera than you saw in that picture. It's supposedly very nice. I talked to the UC Berkeley group. They used it in a project called Badger, BADGR, and they really liked it and highly recommended it. And it's about the right size and weight. So, I mean, it's 30 to 40 pounds. It's relatively small, but it's really rugged. It's got an onboard computer that's running ROS melodic, so they keep up with in Ubuntu. So that's nice because our other robot is a ROS robot. Hopefully that answers, and hopefully I can tell you more. They're very nice to talk to too, so you can ask them for more information.
Feel free to post the questions in the chat or raise your hand. Jeff, I had a question about using EPROP and spiking RNNs for, I think in your part 2 of the paper, right?
Mm-hmm.
Part 2 of the presentation. So I didn't see a comparison how well it fares with a regular RNN. I think one of your motivations is to kind of demonstrate this on low power hardware and neuromorphic hardware. So was the choice of the spiking neural networks with that EPROP more to suit the neuromorphic hardware, or more so that it is faster or energy efficient? And do you have some comparisons or something to discuss with?
I didn't. I know Moss's group showed it on a bunch of time series data, like speech recognition and things like that. And it's the math in that paper is, any Wolfgang Moss paper is quite complicated, but I think they proved that it was equivalent to back propagation through time. So that was good. So I mean, they wanted, their motivation was to have a recurrent spiking neural net that could do back propagation through time. And that's actually of interest to a lot of people, especially in the neuromorphic computing, I imagine. Honestly, we could have done this with a number of different techniques, I suppose, but what they did when I stripped away all the math was quite simple and lightweight. So that's why we chose it. Because all you need is an eligibility trace for each neuron. That's very easy to keep track of. And then you just need some way to have the loss. And then we update, not every time step. So that's good too. So that makes it very lightweight. So that's why we chose it. We didn't compare it to other ones, but I can imagine with us, anything that basically we'd need to know what neurons were in the wave that got propagated, and then some way of applying the loss to it. So any algorithm that could do that would probably be suitable.
Right. I mean, yeah, my question was more in thinking, did you see that it converged to the optimal solution faster by using this approach over the other approaches? But I guess probably that's more future work.
Yeah, that'll be future work. We didn't do a comparison.
Okay.
Yeah, we compared it to human data and rodent data, but we probably should look at other algorithms and look at recurrent neural nets that aren't spiking necessarily, because I'm sure that'll come up with other people asking that too, and I'd be interested in the answer.
Yeah, and the other question I had was, in your first part of the presentation, you showed a model of the neuron. You said that it's a very simple model with a longer refractory period. Is that a LIF with a longer refractory, or did you modify? Sorry, I didn't get to look at the equations.
Yeah, let's go to the equations. I'm doing it the long way, but by the way, someone asked how they can get in contact with me. So the email is the best way, and I think that last slide I had has other contact information. Yeah, this is the model. And so if the current from neighboring neurons goes above some threshold, which is just 1, then it fires a spike. And after it fires a spike, it goes to a -5. So 5 time steps, it'll be ineligible to fire again. And so that's all we did. And then yeah, if it's spiked, it goes to -5. Otherwise, it just increments 1 every time step.
And that 5 was chosen based on any experimental data?
It could have been, no, it could have been anything. It had to be long enough because the wave propagates. So you don't want the wave to kind of reverberate, right? You want it to propagate in one direction. So you need a refractory period that 5 is probably the minimal. And it really would depend on your on the size of your map, I suppose. But we've used a whole wide range of map sizes, and 5 has been sufficient. So yeah, you could do this with a leaky and a grain fire, but that'd be a little more complex.
Right.
And then when IBM True North and also the Spinnaker people at Telluride did it, they used leaky and grain fire neurons and adjusted their leak accordingly.
Right, right. There's another question from Fatima. Can you?
Yeah, yep, the eligibility trace, yeah. Actually, now it probably would be easier to just do it this way. So if you look at this one, the wave propagation started at 4 and went to 6. And so all of these neurons were active. And then when a neuron is active in the eligibility trace, it goes to 1. And then every time step it decays by time constant. And so this color coding shows that this is a 1, and this is, I forget what the time constant was for this, but this is a lower value and a lower value. So when you apply the loss, it'll be most applied to these neurons. And then when we did this in a more complex simulation where we told it to go from here, 12, 7 to 2, 7, so this straight line from A to B, on one of the earlier trials, it basically, the wave just propagated out to these points, and then it hit the goal, and so the wave stopped, and these yellows are all the last neurons that are active. These oranges were the previous time step, and so on down to here where it started, where there's very low time step. And then after I learned the maze, because these yellow areas are high cost, these are the neurons that were active during a traverse from A to B. And you see they're more active because it took far less time to go from A to B. And so a lot of these neurons were active quite recently, and they're learning more about the map environment. They're learning a little bit about these branches too.
I hope that answers your question, Fatima.
Does it? Okay, good.
Any other questions for Dr. Krichmar?
I have a question also. So what do you think was the most unexpected result that you got, especially when we talk about humans? I'm in particular, I'm interested in this topic because since the GPS is, I think we all kind of changed the way we navigate areas just because we can rely on technology to do that more.
Well, one was the original finding, which was if you just give the Mary Haggerty's, let me find it there. Her group and published this paper a couple of years ago. I thought it was really interesting. So this was surprising. Instructions matter. So they had done the original navigation work with people, and we're showing gender differences and that kind of stuff. But then Mary and her colleagues said, "What if we just tell them take the shortest path?" And then that really that little instruction changed their behavior drastically. So I found that surprising and wanted to model it. And then what was the big surprise from our work that Carol and I did, and I glossed over this, so I should mention her name. She goes by Carol, but she's a fantastic student at UC Santa Barbara that worked with me on this. And so what we were surprised with is you could better explain the data that people were not just, this was not a typical subject where they only did one thing. This was just, these were extreme subjects. So when we looked at closer, one surprise was people from trial to trial, maybe it depends on their mood or whatever, are using a whole range of strategies. So that was one thing that we found very surprising. And then the second piece we found surprising was we could better fit the data if we included switching strategies within one trial. So a person would, and what was surprising is it always went in one direction. The person would start on a learned route, and then about halfway through would then take a shortcut. So those two things were surprising because there's like, wow, there's much more variation, from person to person, but also within a person from moment to moment. That was surprising. And that's something that we really want to see if that makes a difference for, autonomous systems like robotic swarms.
So yeah, how will you translate that into the robotic side?
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing we're talking about is just taking this distribution and having a team of robots. And this would be like the likelihood that they take any given strategy and see if that confers some advantage. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Jeff, for the wonderful talk. We do not have any further questions, but if you have more questions for Dr. Krichmar, you can reach out to him. He has provided his contact information.
Yeah, feel free. Thank you for all the great questions and for listening. And yeah, there's the website, and then my email is on the website, or you can just look me up, you'll find me. And then if you have some other question you wanted to ask.
Thank you all for joining us today.
Yes, thank you. And hope to see you all in person soon.
Yeah, in spring.
In spring, in March.
Bye, Jeff.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.